uh, that was even talked about when I was interviewing here a long time ago was a question of music during uh, during services on Shabbat, of instrumental music. So, one, for the sake of reference, more when we talk tonight, uh, we'll talk about music. Instrumental music will be the default for what we mean. Um, uh, so that's one thing. And the other thing is we'll sort of walk through sources on this, and the focus tonight will be on the halachic question, which is to say, what does Jewish law say about this, and what has Jewish law said about this? What does the tradition say about it? Does it say about this? There's a separate and parallel issue, which is the sort of like sociological aspect of which is or the ta'am, or the feel of it, right? Which is, if it is okay, do you want to do it? That's a different question that we'll talk about less tonight. Tonight, like where we're going to start out with is to walk through biblical, like, timeline wise, biblical, and then the classical rabbinic, and then the modern views on the topic of instrumental music on Shabbat, and then we can do a Q&A and back and forth. The other part of that will be questions that you have. Put them in the chat, even like as we're going along. Put them in the chat, and then Gabe, I believe, will moderate them and throw them back at Rabbi Sisi and myself at relevant points or at the end. But if you have a question, just like type it into the chat if you're able. And with that, I believe we get to go right into.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so you should be seeing in front of you a slide. So we're going to do this via slides. And we're gonna, as Rabbi Dan said, we're gonna take a little bit of a tour through some sources, and we're gonna start with our biblical sources, as we do when we do any sort of study of Jewish law. We start with the Bible. Our biblical sources are the basis upon which all of the Jewish law tradition are based. We certainly don't necessarily make legal decisions from the Bible, but that is, of course, what all of our legal decisions are rooted in. So this is just to sort of set the tone. As you can see, sing unto God a new song, using musical instruments in tefillah on Shabbat, in prayer on Shabbat. And we have, of course, our paragon for praising God with musical instruments, Miriam and the women at the parting of the Sea of Reeds. Hang on a second. Okay, if I do this, I'm just a little concerned that on your screens you can't see me and all of the little boxes and the slides. So you'll have to move your Zoom windows accordingly, but here is how the slides go. So our first section is going to be our biblical sources, the Psalms, and curiously the book of Numbers, which is traditionally more of a legal document to start out with. So we'll start with our first Psalm, Psalm 150, which is the last of the books in the book of Psalms. I'm going to go through some of these texts a little quickly. They're there for you to peruse while Rabbi Dan and I are speaking, but we certainly won't necessarily do a deep dive into every source. But the gist of Psalm 150, the summary, the pinnacle of the book of Psalms, which the Psalms themselves are prayers that were poetry and prayers that were often set to music, says that when you praise God, you start by praising God where God lives, in God's sanctuary, in the sky, and God's stronghold all around us, what you praise God for, and lastly, how you praise God. And the author, who is presumed to be King David for at least some of the Psalms, was someone who was familiar with how Jewish worship worked, and particularly temple worship. And in the times of the temple, in both of our temples, the first and the second one, the worship service, the tefillah, the prayer, and the avodah, the worship that involved sacrifices and offerings to God, was accompanied by music. There was a choir of Levites who would sing. There's this beautiful idea that every instrument prays, and you can see all the different instruments that are mentioned in this psalm. Well, even more specifically, Psalm 92, which may be familiar to you from, you may recognize this from such hits as Kabbalat Shabbat. On Friday nights, we praise God using a group of psalms. Once again, we enhance our service with music. And as Rabbi Dan started with his introduction, we are specifically saying musical, and our shorthand is often using music on Shabbat. But of course, we use music on Shabbat. We use vocal music. We sing, we clap, and there's an intention to what I'm about to say. We sing and we clap, we dance, and we in some cases play musical instruments. Now, we assume that to be the case, that of course you're going to sing the tefillah. The tefillah is meant to be sung, but that wasn't necessarily always the case. In the time of the temple, it happened. Then there was a period of time where it may or may not have been prohibited to even sing. Now, we're going to talk about this in a little bit, so hold that in the back of your head. But here, Psalm 92 imagines a world where a song for the Sabbath day is sung. It is good to praise Adonai, to sing, and then look at line 4, with a 10-stringed harp, with voice and lyre together. You have gladdened me by your deeds, Adonai. I shout for joy at your handiwork. So there is this understanding, and I'm just going to pause for a moment. There's an understanding that, and I've often said this about music, whether it be vocal music or instrumental music, that music moves us in a way that words alone do not. Words move us. We are creatures of words. We speak and we utter words, much like God who created the world with words. We create so much with our words. But the words sometimes are not sufficient. And all over our liturgy, all over the prayers that we say, is this sense that without that music elevates our words, that together they come together. We sing nigunim, wordless melodies, because sometimes just the music is enough. So there is this sense that worshiping God, showing gratitude to God, saying hallelujah and wow about God's creation are augmented by music, whether that is vocal or, in this case, as it says in the psalm, on Shabbat we should play instruments and sing with God. Okay, and lastly, just to touch on this, I loved this source because it says, and on your joyous occasions, on your holidays, specifically your fixed festivals and your new moon, Rosh Chodesh, you shall sound the trumpets over your offerings. It says you shall, right? This is a commandment that in some sense we are potentially, if you read Numbers this way, we are commanded to praise God and use on our joyous occasions, on our festivals, on Rosh Chodesh, we are invited to bring musical instruments to the table. So that is to set the stage from a biblical framework, that music, that our Bible itself recognizes the beautiful moving capacity of music, and that it is used in worship and in tefillah and prayer and conversation with God. So then we move forward in time to our rabbinic sources and law codes. You can see we're going to hit a few things here: Rambam, the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Tosafot. I'll tell you who they are if you don't know, and the Shulchan Aruch, the law codes. So Rabbi Dan will take over for a little bit of Rambam. You're on mute, my friend. There.
Thank you. So with that, like that sort of that piece, and almost specifically the piece from Psalm 92, where they have where it says, "Oh, play the harp and you play music on Shabbat in the temple, not a temple, but the temple." You get to the point that we might be familiar with, which is this sense of like, wait a minute, but that's not what actually goes on Shabbat, or we know that for much of Jewish history, this wasn't done. So what's going on there? And Maimonides, I feel like, frames the issue of Shabbat well, which is to say that there's no question that instrumentation is sort of fine 6 days a week. You can even say Psalm 150 talks about praising God, but it may or may not be talking about on Shabbat the way the piece from the book of Numbers or Psalm 92, the Psalm for Shabbat, is talking very specifically about Shabbat. Maimonides just sort of like boils down a sense of the key issues that have to be faced. There are 4 things have been are spoken of regarding Shabbat. 2 of them are found in the Torah, and 2 of them are in the Divrei Sofrim, that the sages of teach. And and expressed by the prophets. He says, the Torah, famously, will say, Zachor v'shamor, right? You know this from both the Torah itself and from saying Halakha, Zachor v'shamor b'dibur echad.
Thank you.
That's exactly the melody. That's in the Ten Commandments. It says to remember Shabbat in Exodus in the Zachor, and to shamor, observe or guard or keep in Deuteronomy when the Ten Commandments are restated, right? And we sing this poetically in Chadodi that they were spoken at once. Remember is sort of is a lighter aspect of it, or more, that it's almost like a celebrate it, and the shamor, the observe or guard, is the almost like the prohibitions aspect of it. That there are two things going on with Shabbat. One is remember Shabbat, i.e., and make sure that it's a joyful, restful day for you, and at the same time, there are certain things you're supposed to refrain from doing, and that's the keep. So it's not just that Shabbat is always supposed to be in traditional Jewish thought, going back to the Torah, is always supposed to be just whatever helps you to rest. That's what you should do. There's an aspect of that, and that's the Zachor, the remember. But the observe is always and always make sure that you avoid certain things that are expressly prohibited on Shabbat. And traditionally, these are 39 different activities that are enumerated in the Mishnah. Maimonides goes on to say that the Torah says to remember and observe. That's sort of like the positive and like the do's and the don'ts, as it were. And the prophets clearly speak of honor and delight. Kavod ve'oneg. Oneg doesn't mean a parve cookie at 9 at night, though you might fondly at this point in time remember that that's what it once meant. Oneg means delight, right? And honor, and this is sort of like a similar vector. Honoring, kavod of Shabbat means sort of honoring the laws of it and the strictures of it. As God rested, so we must rest. And anything that is the sort of creative labor or changing the world is thought of that what you don't do on Shabbat. And then there's delight, which is that, and with that, you should make sure that you have oneg, that the day is delight. It's not supposed to be oppressive. It's a commandment to enjoy the Shabbat. So those two vectors are what's important here with Maimonides, sort of the two things at once. And that's where the pressure with instrumental music will come in, hitting the Zachor and the Shamor and the Oneg and the Kavod, all the different aspects of it. Next one. We're going to go, that's from Maimonides, who's living 1,000 years ago. This is the Mishnah, much older than that. The Mishnah, the first great work of rabbinics after the time of the Bible, the first one to sort of be formalized. Says regarding Shabbat, every act, every act for one which is liable, meaning that you are guilty of a transgression if you do it, is because of shvut. Shvut is, we translate here as mandated rest. Shvut, a little hard thing to define. There are Shabbat prohibitions, and then there are Shabbat prohibitions. Some things are forbidden because the Torah says not to do them. Torah says not to gather sticks. Torah says not to light a fire. That's sort of like in black letters on white parchment. And it's very clear. Other things aren't done on Shabbat. For shvut, shvut either means a fence around an existing prohibition, which is to say to keep you far from a possible transgression, or sort of decree to maintain a certain mood on the day. So shvut can mean one of those two things, either part of a fence to keep you away from something that the Tanakh prohibits, or it's a or it's just a decree, not necessarily to keep you away from prohibition, but to create a certain sort of restful atmosphere, a certain vibe, for lack of a better term, on Shabbat. And some things are only optional reshut, even though it's command, even though it's a mitzvah, that's less important. The next paragraph is what's important. For the following acts, you're liable, meaning you've transgressed a mitzvah, you've done the wrong thing because of shvut. Shvut rules mean you can't, the Mishnah says, you can't climb a tree, you cannot ride on an animal, and you can't swim in water, and you can't clap hands, nor slap, and this seems to be like slap your thighs, or dance. The things you're not supposed to do on Shabbat, and elsewhere it'll go through this. You're not supposed to climb a tree, you might break off part of the limb. You might not supposed to ride an animal, you might break off part of a tree in order to hit your animal to get it to go faster. And you're not supposed to swim in water. You might gather all these sticks together, something like this, in order to, you might form a flotation device. So you're creating things or breaking apart things because you know that. And clapping hands, nor slapping, nor dancing, those are in a different category that we'll talk about. But notice here it says the prohibitions on Shabbat. You can't clap, you can't sort of slap your thighs to or dance. Those last three seem to have to do with music.
Okay. Sorry. You
No,
ready?
yeah, go on to the next one. Perfect timing. Then the next piece is the Talmud, writing slightly later, commenting on the Mishnah, tries to define what is the Mishnah talking about there? What does it mean you can't clap on Shabbat? That says you can't clap or slap, again, probably your thighs in this, or dance around. Why does that prohibition exist? It's not like the climbing a tree where I'm going to break off part of the tree, and that's and I'm sort of permanently altering nature, so don't do it. What if I'm clapping? I'm not altering nature. So what's going on there? They say it's a preventative measure, a gezerah, lest you might repair musical instruments. In other words, it seems to be they're saying that there's a prohibition on clapping and similar things, dancing around on Shabbat, because that's being done in an atmosphere where music is playing. And if music is playing, something's going to go wrong with the music, or the instrument will break, and somebody will be tempted to repair it. So just like I don't climb a tree because I might break off a limb, and that will violate the sort of leave nature as it is on Shabbat. There's a prohibition on repairing things on Shabbat, and that clapping, slapping, or dancing around is a preventative measure to prevent you from repairing music. So you follow like their steps here.
Right. So just as like Rabbi Dan, this is the big sort of thing that we're going to come back to, is this idea of the shvut is you can't climb the tree. There's nothing prohibited in those 39 acts that Rabbi Dan referred to that is you can't climb a tree. But the rabbis put this shvut saying you can't climb the tree because you might pluck something off the tree once you're up there inadvertently or on purpose, and that's what we're trying to prevent that from happening. So by analogy, this right here, and this is like the crux of it, is you're the repairing of the musical instruments is the thing you can't do. So to prevent us from doing that, the rabbis put a shvut saying we can't clap, slap our thighs, or dance on Shabbat. But
now we know what you all know, which is you've spent your life, maybe, or part of your life, hopefully, going to synagogues, and you've seen people clap in synagogues, maybe even slap their thighs, and you might have even seen people dance. But you less commonly see musical instruments. And like notice there's sort of like a tension here already. There's a cognitive dissonance between what the sources say and what goes on. What we're not now, for reasons of time, there's a couple of things that we're not entirely bringing here, which is that there's an additional somewhat complication in the sources that, oh, well, maybe, because I don't think we included these, maybe the music isn't done on Shabbat out of mourning for the temple. right? That after the temple is destroyed, we're sad and we can never truly feel happy again. You know this from breaking a glass under the kuppah, and that not having instrumentation on Shabbat is part of that mourning. So that's another vector that goes on. Though it's worth noting that the earliest sources, that level of the Mishnah, doesn't seem to have an express prohibition on musical instruments, though we do find this, which is the implication in the Talmud of you might repair the instrument, and that's implied from clapping, from the prohibition on clapping, which if you're less you repair it implies that, well, maybe you shouldn't have it to begin with.
Right. And Rabbi Dan, you said something, and I thought you were going in this direction, but you didn't. That there's a lot of stuff that we cut a little for time about how we get to this point, and I'll address this a little bit about, wait, but we do clap, we do slap, and we do dance on Shabbat, which is what Rabbi Dan said. If you come to synagogue at all, you've seen all of these things happen on Shabbat. And there's a whole lot of Talmud that talks about why that leniency, we're going to get to it in a second, a bit of it, but why all of a sudden that shavut, that clapping, slapping, and dancing gets sort of thrown away because people aren't doing it anyway. People are dancing and clapping and slapping their thighs and banging on tables on Shabbat. And there's a little bit of a discussion of that we've cut or truncated for time.
But it is hilarious to read. We read through these sources of century after century after century after century of heavyweight rabbis essentially being like, ugh, it says it in black and white, don't clap, and everyone does it. Like it's sort of you can sort of sense this sort of like frustration in time till they get
and it's not and it's not just about the slapping and clapping. There are a number of other things that it's like there's all of these shvut things, these fences around the Torah, the fences around prohibited acts. They're like, well, we said not to do this, but people are doing, like, there's a lot of that happens, and it really does read like they're slapping their heads. It really is kind of interesting. Yeah.
So let's continue.
Tosafot. Okay. So on that, in that regard, the Tosafot. So we know our favorite commentator Rashi, who comments on both the Bible and the Talmud. The medieval French guy. He's also making wine. He's really great.
The rabbi's class. The rabbi's class.
His grandchildren are the Tosafot, and the Tosafot, Tosefas like to add to. And what the Tosafot tended to do, they're literally Rashi's grandkids and students. They take the whole body of the Bible and the Gemara, the Talmud, and try to sort of harmonize it, where like little pieces are all around. They're trying to sort of make it all make sense. And so they say on this, one does not clap or dance, which we are all shaking our heads, as did Rashi and the Tosafot in the Middle Ages, going, what do you mean we don't do this? We do this. So they summarize Rashi. They say, Rashi explained, lest one repair a musical instrument. However, for us, clapping and dancing are permitted, because specifically in their day, they're trying to explain and harmonize the fact that around them people are clapping and dancing. They say, because specifically in their days, meaning the people who wrote the Mishnah, when they were experts in making musical instruments, it was appropriate to make this decree. But for us who are not experts in making musical instruments, it is not appropriate to make this decree. So this is kind of a profound statement. They're trying to find a reason behind all of this. And what they come up with is, again, Rabbi Dan introduced the concept of a shvut. Shvut can be removed. The shvut is that fence, or that calling something less Shabbos-y, so that we can then prevent us from getting to an actual prohibited act. We can remove those for a couple of reasons. One is for the sake of a mitzvah. We'll talk about that, or for the sake of public good. But they're saying that if the underlying prohibition no longer applies, then the shvut around it is unnecessary. They're saying, we don't know how to make guitars. We don't know how to make violins. So if a violin is being played on Shabbat, and incidentally, this is happening in the days of the Talmud because people would get married on a Friday afternoon, and Shabbos evening, the wedding party would still be going on. There's a corollary conversation about whether or not non-Jews can play wedding music to celebrate on Shabbat. And so there's a whole conversation about what's happening here is not just, and they make a little bit of a distinction between music in services for tefillah and music for just simchas like a wedding celebration. But the whole point of this is to say, in their day, they could have fixed a broken violin on Shabbat. And so to prevent them from doing that, like, oops, it's Shabbos and I'm fixing my guitar, there's this decree saying no clapping and slapping and dancing. They're saying that they don't know how to fix a guitar, so there's no danger of them fixing a guitar or a lyre or a bass or a cello on or a hurdy-gurdy, whatever they're playing. They're not going to fix it, so we don't need this injunction. And this is sort of the crux of the argument going forward. This is sort of the turning point where we have this whole body of literature telling us, or this small body of literature telling us that these things, that this is prohibited. Slapping and clapping are prohibited lest you fix a musical instrument, and then by implication, fixing musical instruments is what is the forbidden act. So again, nowhere does it say you're not allowed to play a musical instrument on Shabbat. It never says that. What it says is you can't clap or dance on Shabbat because you might fix a musical instrument. Everyone clear on that? That's what the text says. Okay.
I want to go back for a moment, if I may, and throw in there, because this is where, specifically, I hadn't seen Tosfot. If you look on the Talmud page, there, the long stuff on the outside. So it's not something that everyone's read. And this was a piece that I had not seen before we look at this time. And I say, and I want to pause and highlight this because in the past, when we've talked about this, I've cited specifically that, like the prohibition on fixing instruments and tuning.
Yeah, I was going to say that's been in the chat. So let's go there. We were going to go there later, but let's go there now.
Yeah, tuning the guitar string I want to highlight it because it's on the screen, like as fixing. So this is where it really is reading this source where the Tosfot, Rashi's grandsons, are and crew. They are they clearly, or to me it looks like clearly, don't think that tuning the strings is fixing. Because to say that back in those days they knew how to fix an instrument, but me, I don't. They can't. Anyone who's playing, most anyone who's playing a stringed instrument, like anyone playing a guitar, after a couple of lessons, like has a feel for tuning it. And that's not it's not a skill I particularly have, but like that's not a super special skill. Everyone playing the instrument knows how to do that. It's not like, piano, you don't know how to play the piano, you don't know how to tune a piano. But with stringed instruments, with guitars, things like this, you actually do know how to do it. So when they say fixing or making, they clearly don't mean that. They must mean if I smash my guitar, or they don't have guitars, but if I smash my instrument, I don't know how to fix it. I'm not an instrument maker that I would know how to do that. It doesn't mean adjusting like this. They must have thought of adjusting a string as not a fix, but rather like not in the category of fixing, but in the category of a minor and temporary adjustment. The same way you're not supposed to tie a knot to keep a sail in place on Shabbat because you want that knot to be very permanent and lasting. I can tie a necktie on Shabbat because I know it's not going to be permanent and lasting, even if it's going to last until after Shabbat. If I'm doing it in the afternoon or whatever, like that, like I can do it because the necktie knot isn't permanent and lasting. It seems that they think of tuning as a minor, not permanent and lasting adjustment that you can make, like tying a tie maybe, and not like building and fixing a new instrument. Because of course, as we know, when you tune a guitar, 20 minutes later, you're tuning it again. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
more like
So
tying a tie than it is like putting some fix.
right. So, yes, we were gonna. This was gonna be later in the presentation, so it'll come up again. But I think it's really important, and there's a second distinction I want to make sure we make is that we're making a distinction between fixing the instrument, tuning the instrument, and something in between, which is fixing a broken string. When we're specifically talking about stringed instruments, right? Or a broken reed, right? If we're talking about an oboe or something like that, or a clarinet, those things. So as Rabbi Dan said, that it's any guitar player, let's use guitar because it's an easy one to sort of, that everyone has seen and everyone sort of knows how a guitar kind of works, that no one expects that the tuning is temporary. So that's not fixing. That's not, you're not making something permanent. As Dan says, Rabbi Dan says, it's like tying your tie, tying your shoes on Shabbat. Those things are not intended for long-term measures. Fixing a string, however, if a string breaks, that is a more intensive thing. That's not something that happens every time I play guitar. I've broken strings twice in the 20 years I've played guitar. So that is probably closer to fixing the instrument. If a string breaks on my guitar, and one of those two times was on a Friday night, I put the guitar aside. I played it as best as I could, broken as it were, and then I put it aside. And then from then on, I always have a second guitar tuned and ready to go in case that happens. The third piece is fixing the instrument. So there's tuning a string, temporary fix, not a permanent fix. It's not a fix at all. It's just part of playing. Fixing a string, which is probably closer to fixing an instrument. And then there's fixing or making an instrument. So if my guitar snapped because I broke it, like I dropped it on the floor, that's it. I'm done playing on that instrument for Shabbat. Now, I want to make another distinction that comes up later, that instruments like an organ or a piano in our modern sources that we're going to get to at the end of the presentation, those, you don't tune a piano every time you play it. You come in, you have a piano tuner come in, and it gets tuned once a year, maybe once every 6 months if you're really playing it. So those kinds of fixes are distinguished because they're not, that's more like tying your sail on Shabbat. That's more of a permanent situation. And so the distinctions in the modern context, because like they didn't have, they had organs, they had pipe instruments, but they didn't have the same kinds of instruments. They weren't, those kinds of instruments don't get tuned every 15, 20 minutes when you play them. And so therefore, those instruments would likely not be able to be tuned on Shabbat. So does everyone get the distinction on that? Okay, so those are the sort of different things. Just to clarify once again, tuning is not the same as fixing if we're talking about having a particular amount of skill to fix an instrument. And the Tosafot seem to cover that. Okay. So next on our list, I'm going to go, this is actually just a quickie. So this is another Mishnah. When the Sanhedrin ceased, and remember the Sanhedrin was the legal body that governed during the height of rabbinic Judaism, we often talk about a concern that actually, by the way, pause on what I just read for a second. We often talk about the destruction of the temple and being in mourning for the temple as another reason why people don't do instrumentation on Shabbat. The actual prohibition that occurred was in deference to being in mourning for the temple. All music ceased. We didn't sing either. And gradually over time, that is added back in. So here you'll see that gets added back in many centuries ago. So you'll see that there's sort of a loosening of what the mourning for the temple gets loosened up because Hillel, Rabbi Dan brought me a text I hadn't seen that Hillel was like, what? So we should not eat meat ever because we're in mourning. Like the over and over, we can't, you shouldn't drink water because we're in mourning. All of this stuff. Anyway, so this is to say, when the Sanhedrin ceased, songs ceased from their place of feasting. As it is said, they drink their wine without song. So even singing had ceased. And I brought this to just sort of say that we eventually brought it back. So here, similarly, this is the Shulchan Aruch, later legal code, 18th century. So I never get my centuries right.
16th.
16. Oh my God, I went the wrong direction. I was thinking 17. Okay, never mind. I botched that up. 1600. Anyway, similarly, they decreed not to play music with instruments and musical devices and all things that make music to rejoice with them. There are those who say the prohibition, wait, this isn't the text I wanted next, is it? Yeah, no, it is. I'm sorry. Okay. Right. There are those who say the prohibition is specifically for those whom they regularly play them, like for kings who stand and rest to instruments in the house of a feast. It is forbidden to make them heard because of the destruction, or even song by mouth over wine is forbidden, as it says, in song one may not drink wine. Again, because of the destruction here is referring to the temple. And all of Israel is already accustomed to saying words of praise or songs of thanks and remembering the goodness of the Holy Blessed One over wine, right? We say Kiddush, we sing, we do all of this stuff. Similarly, for the need of a mitzvah, like the house of a groom or bride, all of this is permitted. Okay, so this is a little bit of a complicated text to unpack kind of quickly, but we'll do our best. Hang on, I'm just looking at my notes. So what's happening here? We're saying that this is to sort of show that at one point in time, because of the destruction of the temple, because of the loss of the Sanhedrin, all of this stuff, we stopped singing. We stopped doing rejoicing with music, vocal and instrumental. And over time, that was loosened up. Singing became the way of things, because in other places in the Shulchan Aruch, how we sing in the synagogue and what chazanim and what prayer leaders do is a huge topic of conversation. So by the time we're in like the, at the end of the medieval period, we're already singing again. We're already clapping, as we learned from the Tosafot. We're already clapping and slapping again. There's even a sense you'll see in the next piece of the Shulchan Aruch. There's definitely a sense that perhaps musical instruments are even permitted. So we'll see that. Right, that's what we wanted to say here. Was there anything else I'm missing? This little piece here. What I said before, one of the reasons you can remove a shvut, that fence around the prohibition, is for the need of a mitzvah, for the house of a groom or bride, all of this is permitted. Or, for example, if you needed, for some reason, you needed to not violate, but let down a shvut to help a dead body. All of these sorts of things, for the sake of the mitzvah, and one could argue that services are a mitzvah for which one can alleviate a shvut. Okay. And then our last one, this is still me, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so this is a place where I'm going to preface this, where the Ramah, the gloss on the Shulchan Aruch, he's going to come and say, he says a little of both. He both says, no, you shouldn't, and maybe you can. And that's okay. Remember, we love to live in the black and whites as Jews. We don't, very few things are, except for those 39 prohibited acts and their derivative things. We like to live in that sort of ambiguous place of grayness. So he says, this is the Shulchan Aruch. One should not clap one's hands together, nor clap. This is the same Mishnah. This is the same, based on that same Mishnah. One should not clap one's hands together or clap a hand on a thigh, nor dance. This is a decree, remember that's the shvut, instituted so that one will not come to fix a musical instrument. There's our guiding principle. Fine. What does he say next? And even tapping one's fingers on the ground or on a board or snapping them together like singers do, like you can imagine, right? Like lie, banging on the stender, right? That's what he's talking about. Or snapping them together like singers do, or rattling nuts together for a baby, or playing with a pair of nuts so that he will be quiet. All of this and similar such things are forbidden from a decree, from the shvut, so that one will not come to fix a musical instrument, right? He's just outlining what we already know. That's what the Shulchan Aruch takes what's in the Mishnah and Talmud and codifies it. Remember, the Talmud is like a little bit here, and the Shulchan Aruch, as Rambam also does in his work, tries to categorize it by here's all the law in one place on one subject, okay? So he says, but clapping the back of one's hand is permitted. So those of you who may have been watching on Friday night, I did this because we had just learned this text together. Okay, the Ramah. But there are those who clap and dance nowadays, and we should not stop them because it is better. Now he has two reasons. One, better that they do it unintentionally. We shouldn't tell them they're doing it wrong so that they do it with intention. Better they don't know and they violate it. But there's also this piece here, and this is what I find fascinating. The second piece. And there are those who say that today all of this is permitted because we are not experts in fixing instruments, right? This is the Tosafot. And we cannot decree lest one comes to fix an instrument, for it is a thing which happens so infrequently. So it's possible that because of this, the custom is to be lenient on all of this. So he's saying maybe it's forbidden. And if it's forbidden, we shouldn't say anything to the people who are doing it so that they're not knowingly violating something that's prohibited. Or maybe it isn't prohibited, and because it's not prohibited, because for exactly what the Tosafot said right here, that we're not going to fix our instruments. And again, this is another tick in the box that the tuning is not the same as fixing, because that was probably happening. I think medieval instruments went out of tune much more frequently than even from my music history knowledge. There wasn't a standard set of tuning, so there wasn't a need to tune, because you weren't really. I mean, there was. Sorry, I said that the wrong way around. There wasn't a standard set of tuning, right? In today's musical instruments, A is the frequency of 440 megahertz. So you know that it's always going to be a 440. So your instrument, your guitar, and that guy's guitar, they're playing in their own key. So when you're playing together, you got to tune to each other. So tuning is happening all the time in these medieval instruments, even more so than it is today. So maybe it's not forbidden at all, he says, and we should let it happen. Okay, pausing. Modern applications. Now, this is where I'll turn it back to my esteemed colleague, Rabbi Daniel Salzberg, to talk a little about how the halachic process works through all of this that we've been talking about, and then how we apply it in our modern day, because we are the inheritors of the halachic tradition, and we continue to, none of this is stagnant. It grows and changes all the time.
So just a brief word on Halakha, Jewish law, which is a sense that it as is known to all of you, lacks a pope, as it were. There's no single authority. Traditionally, people are able, through the generations, rabbis have written to rabbis that they respect on questions that they don't understand, and gotten a response as to what's the best move for their community at this time, right? This became somewhat formalized in the conservative movement that took that basic idea that rabbis make decisions for their communities and write to somebody they think is more learned when they have a question they can't handle, with a committee on Jewish law and standards that would of people who just have maybe more muscles to flex on these things to address specific issues. Doesn't require a majority vote of the committee to become an official position. It just requires a minority vote. I think 6 of the 25 individuals, and that just becomes something that has formal approval. Doesn't mean that its LAC doesn't have formal approval, but it's just a little bit how it works. Rabbis aren't technically limited to what's commonly called the law committee says. It's just sort of like a point of reference, and they helpfully do the homework for us. Next slide.
Sorry. No. Hold on. Sorry. Boop. There.
One of the earlier writings on this in the conservative movement is in 1958. The Reform movement from its inception began with doing organ music already in the early 19th century. It's one of the things that distinguished the Reform movement in its early days was the use of the organ. Though the Reform movement sort of like formally said that they would consult, but they didn't feel like they had to rely on being within the bounds of Jewish law. So the question that came in the 50s is it the case that an organ is in fact permissible or not? 1958, it allowed me to pull out this book. I don't know if you can see it. This is Proceedings of the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards of the Conservative Movement from 1927 to 1970, volume 3. I'll point out not only do I own it, but there's actually coffee stains on it, so it has been partially read.
I'm impressed. I had to track down a PDF from a colleague.
No, actually, there's folds in the binding whole bit. I actually read parts of it. So this is from there, though I hadn't read this for this. The summary of this is on your screen. That the response of the reasoning, described the ways that organ music could conceivably enhance services, and it claimed the organ was a permissible mitzvah accessory, a devar mitzvah. And he goes through. He's like, look, you saw the reference in the Shulchan Aruch, the first piece from the Shulchan Aruch that Rabbi Sisi brought, like the black on white halakha that some of the sources say is that after the destruction of the temple, all music is prohibited. Like the wording from that, what you read is a shir over a cup of wine, which is literally prohibiting singing the kiddush, these things that are that we commonly associate with Jewish practice. Some of the sources forbid, and so it says, and we know that this isn't how Judaism developed. That there's something on the books that isn't being observed, and that includes things like singing and on Shabbat or anytime or clapping, and he says that talking about an organ, because that's the style at the time, should be permitted as well. And indeed, if you visit many conservative synagogues constructed in this era, in the late 40s, 50s, more commonly, early 60s, conservative synagogues will have big organs in them, saying that the prohibition on musical instruments on Shabbat and Yom Tov was rabbinic, it's just a shvut, and that and like the Tosfot, that when they make a sociological decision for their time, there are instances where, when the sociology changes, you can say that, well, that's no longer in force. That doesn't go for everything. A colleague, Rabbi Sisi, brought, when we were studying texts from a colleague, Rabbi Aaron Alexander, who points out, look, like this works sometimes and it doesn't work other times, right? The rabbis, some of you know the story of why do the rabbis say we do a Haftarah? Why, after reading the Torah portion, do we do this other thing, the Haftarah? And they would say that, well, there was a time when the Romans outlawed studying Torah, so you couldn't read from a Torah. So we'd read a thing from the rest of the Bible that is similar in theme. And even though that decree no longer exists, the Romans aren't busting down your doors saying that you can't study Torah, we still read Haftorah. So in that instance, even though the original reason is gone, we keep the tradition. Situations changed, but the tradition remains. There are other instances where that's not the case. He brings the example of Cholav Yisrael. In ancient times, they would only take milk or any dairy product from a Jewish farmer because they're afraid that the milk would be cut with pig's milk. And in modern America, Moshe Feinstein, the sort of foremost Orthodox authority, said that, the FDA checks all this stuff for you. The FDA makes sure that the milk that you think is cow's milk is in fact cow's milk. They're doing the checking for you. You don't have to worry about who milks it anymore because the situation has changed. So it's an instance where sometimes the situation changes and we keep the tradition. Sometimes the situation changes and we don't. The argument here is, here the situation has changed. We can, in addition, sort of like there's a sense of, if we're mourning the temple after the founding of the state of Israel, some of those temple prohibitions can fall by the wayside because the temple mean literally the building, or is it a stand-in for Jewish sovereignty and dignity? And if it's a stand-in for Jewish sovereignty and dignity, then the creation of the state of Israel sort of creates a different reality that lessens the need to mourn the temple anymore. The next one, from another contemporary rabbi, Rabbi Jamie Alpert, that commenting on that same organ tshuva brings up another thing, that the reasoning is that no one was going to carry an organ, right? Many of you are familiar with the prohibition on sounding a shofar on Rosh Hashanah, on Shabbat, when Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbat, lest you carry it to synagogue, which is, of course, an odd prohibition because carrying things doesn't seem to be in the Torah, but blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah is super expressly mentioned in the Torah. So carrying things tends to be an issue. So look, that's not the case with an organ because you're not carrying an organ. it's unlikely to break on Shabbat. This isn't an organ isn't a guitar string, right? It's not going to break. And then again, like the mentioning of the creation of the state of Israel, sort of lessening these prohibitions on how can you mourn the temple when we're constructing a commonwealth when the Jewish people are constructing a commonwealth in the state of Israel again. There's another factor, which brings in that what you learn about organs may not apply to a guitar because of course, a guitar can be carried. The next one, one of the other objections to halakhic objections is that a instrument sits still unless you begin to play it, of course, and that maybe playing the instrument is like makeh patish, one of the prohibitions, the 39 Mishnah prohibitions on Shabbat, which is you shouldn't complete something, literally striking the final hammer blow, which is just even if you're doing something, you shouldn't take something that's incomplete and complete it. The same way God sort of rests from completion on Shabbat. They say, surely the production of sound by hitting a key cannot by any stretch of even a fertile imagination be termed finishing the work. The Talmud, of course, has no mention of playing an instrument as being considered part of the 38 other prohibitions of forbidden activities on Shabbat. And it's not in a formal paper. It's just sort of like in a footnote in these same volumes. In the law committee meeting, they said, somebody asked like, that organ stuff, does it apply to a stringed instrument? They're like, yeah. They didn't sort of write formally on it, but just sort of said, yeah, it would seem to, in the sense of like anything else you do on Shabbat, we don't prohibit, drinking wine on Shabbat lest you carry the cup, and you don't we don't prohibit taking a talit out of a bag on Shabbat lest you carry the bag on Shabbat. Like there's the prohibition of the shofar seems to be to teach a lesson of the importance of Shabbat more than it means be careful of doing these things on Shabbat, because of course most synagogues, and even back in the day, you could have just said you could only blow the shofar on Shabbat if it's kept there, because we do lots of things on Shabbat on the assumption that you're not carrying outside of an Eruv. The next one.
Okay.
And then the next slide is from one that remains in process from Rabbi Elliot Dorff and Rabbi Elliot Kaplan-Spitz. And this is they published a summary of their paper that they're still working on. And Rabbi Spitz writes in his piece that although most conservative synagogues still forbid musical instruments on Shabbat, some synagogues affiliated with the movement have introduced instrumental music, feeling that the music fosters communal singing, offers beauty, spiritually uplifts, and draws participants. Some argue that the introduction of musical instruments may put a damper on introspection and communal singing. But these dangers are also present with cantorial music and choirs, which are commonly accepted. So this sort of like push and pull. You notice there, that's not being fought on halakhic grounds as much as the aesthetic grounds. Like, what is the effect going to be? Is the effect a net positive or net negative? Does this does it bring people in, or does it make people passive, even if they are brought in? And then there's further discussions, of which you can probably guess, of like, does this feel Jewish or does it not feel Jewish? What does that even mean? Or does this feel traditionally Jewish, or does this feel like it's not traditionally Jewish? They continue on the second paragraph. They have there, the key concerns in our tshuva and our halakhic paper are whether instruments may be played on Shabbat, and if so, how to protect the sanctity of the holy day. We conclude, meaning that when they write, that music making itself is not forbidden. Only making an instrument or fixing it is prohibited. In that regard, the sources forbid replacing a musical string on Shabbat, but may permit tuning. We encourage synagogues to provide for instruments or storage for instruments in order to avoid the need for musicians to carry their instruments from a private to a public domain. And we ask that stage setup and electrical equipment be put into place before Shabbat. Our goal is to provide a balance between enabling music and honoring Shabbat. This is one of those things that's not completed, but in process, but they sort of published part of their process thinking.
Yeah, Rabbi Dan, while you've been speaking, a question has come up that I am going to sort of preempt our moderator on regarding electricity and do organs use electricity? Not all organs do, but those that do, often in synagogues, there is an electric organ. This right here addresses that. That stage setup and electrical equipment. We are living in a world where we turn on ahead of time microphones to use them for and whatnot. We use electricity on Shabbat. We just don't turn it on or off in the synagogue on Shabbat. So the organ would presumptively be on ahead of time. So just wanted to sort of answer that question since it was relevant to this little piece here.
Though, and it is worth noting that both Rabbis Dorff and Spitz are in Southern California, which historically and to the present day tends to be more liberal on in a few different areas that we won't discuss, but also in conservative Jewish practice. The sort of conservative in North America, Canada tends to be most small c conservative, and then sort of like our area, and then sort of like going out. And by the time you get to the West Coast, there tends to be greater, depending on whatever word people want to use. Some say halakha creativity, some say lenient, some say to the left, whatever it might be. It's not surprising that that this comes from there, though the synagogues I mentioned include, Park Avenue Synagogue as a rock band. Anyway, next one, and transition.
Yeah, I think that's the end of your, also just a reiteration of what Rabbi Dan was saying, that that one or the other isn't better or worse or more authentic when we say less liberal or more liberal within our movement, right? That Park Avenue can have a rock band, but a small synagogue in Boise, Idaho can not use electricity. Or as I mentioned in the chat, I've been a member of or worked at 4 different communities that all had an organ, that were all conservative synagogues, weren't synagogues that used to be reform or any of that. It was a thing in the 50s and 60s in our movements. And one of them, in fact, played the organ regularly, had a whole plugged in rock band, but had more people who walked to shul, Persians and other more quote unquote traditional Jews who than any other synagogue I've worked at. So the organ isn't necessarily a barometer for whether one is liberal or conservative in the conservative movement. And also on top of that, that one isn't necessarily better or worse. Our movement and this ability to make decisions on the ground, right? We have a committee for Jewish law and standards, but we also allow individual communities and the rabbis guiding them to make decisions of practice and what their ritual life looks like that is right for that community. And so not one is not better than the other. I caution against that kind of thinking that more is better than less. Just a little thing there. Okay, cool. All right, Rabbi Dan, anything else before I conclude us?
Sure.
Okay, so as you see, our concluding considerations, I just wanted to again reiterate the difference between what we're discussing tonight, which is whether it is forbidden, permitted, allowed, all of that stuff halachically from a legal perspective. The other, whether it feels Jewish, whether it feels right for your community, whether you like the music, that's a different conversation that we can have once we've sort of explored the permissibility of it. Because just because you can do a thing doesn't mean you have to, right? So that's to be said. So I wanted to make sure that if you're thinking about, well, it feels really reform to have an organ and we're not reform. I'm not saying we're getting an organ, but I'm saying if that's the line of thinking you're on, that's a different conversation, a legitimate conversation. There's nothing wrong with that. What we feel and what we have in our kishkas is important as well. But what we're talking about tonight is that when you hear, oh, musical instruments are forbidden, that might not necessarily be the case. Okay. And so the other two things to consider, as Spitz and Dorff sort of say in their responsum, their teshuva, that the ultimate goal when one is adding or changing one's worship in any way, one's tefillah experience or one's ritual life whether it's tefillah and prayer or something else, whether you're taking on a mitzvah, whether you're taking on a practice, that one of the goals is, the idea is to look at the goal, right? One of the concerns that people have when we're talking about something like musical instrumentation on Shabbat is someone says, oh, let's have a band. I saw a band at Park Avenue and it was really cool. We have to be careful of the tail wagging the dog, that the dog is, we have goals for our service, and will musical instruments enhance them? As Rabbi Dan has said, rather than we want to have musical instruments, let's shove them into our service. As Rabbi Dan has said a few times now over the past few weeks, that there is something missing when we can't sing together on Zoom. And because of that, we made a decision to add the guitar into that little box you see on your screen, because there's something missing when we are not singing together in person, and that helps fill that void. Now, that isn't to say that when we get back together, we shouldn't have the guitar, but the whole point is that the goal wasn't, let's just play the guitar. The goal was, something feels missing, maybe the guitar will help with that. That the whole idea was to enhance the service. So that's this hidur mitzvah value that we have in all of our ritual life, right? You can drink your kiddush out of a red solo cup, but it's more beautiful when you have a beautiful dedicated kiddush cup. And that's adding to the beauty of our mitzvah, of our ritual life, of our tefillah, and then also increasing participation. And as you saw in the Spitz quote that we had, to some people are afraid that if we bring in musical instruments, people won't participate. It'll take away the participation. But on the other hand, for those who find that music compelling, that will bring people in. And the last thing I wanted to say, before I just go to the last little concluding slides, is that remember these fences. Remember that the prohibition against clapping and dancing was to put a fence around Shabbat. Remember Shamor and Zachor, that we're trying to guard and protect Shabbat observance, that we started this conversation with. And the concern is, what if that fence that you put around Shabbat to protect it actually instead keeps out Shabbat? And that I thought was a really profound statement. I believe Rabbi Dan said that in today when we were going over this, that rather than protecting it, what if something keeps it out? And not to go down this road, but this conversation has been had when it comes to certain things. Like if I put a lock on the door to the building, you can't get in. If I say you can't drive to a synagogue 20 miles away, it's preventing you from being involved in Shabbat. So all of these sorts of considerations. Now, again, driving is actually does violate one of those prohibited acts. You make a fire. And here we're making a distinction that musical instruments don't necessarily violate one of those acts. But my point is to say, what if this rabbinic prohibition around a fence around Shabbat keeps Shabbat out? And what if this is a pathway for involvement? Someone plays guitar and they're 16 years old, and this is their gateway to becoming more involved in their Jewish community. There are lots of different considerations, but right now we're focusing on the halachic one. But I bring those up to say that we don't want the tail to wag the dog, that as we make the halachic considerations, we're also considering our underlying goals in what we want to create for our ritual and tefillah life. Okay, so that being said, just a quick summary of what we went over today. I'm sorry, I'm not looking at the chat now. I see that there is some chat. So again, our moderator will cull the chat. When Rabbi Dan was speaking, I was kind of looking at the chat just to make sure we were on the right page. But I'm not looking, but I will get there to all of your questions, and our moderator will cull them into questions for the panel of Rabbi Sisi and Rabbi Dan. So, halachic things that we just covered. Playing the instrument is never expressly prohibited. There's no, you shall not play guitar on Shabbat anywhere written. It comes from fixing instruments might be considered a prohibited act of melacha. It might be fixing a broken thing, might fall under those 39 categories. Probably does. We're going to go with it, probably does. All right. Shavut is this rabbinic prohibition to safeguard against a prohibited act. Think fences around the Torah. Slapping and clapping and dancing is the shvut we're dealing with. That was was prohibited to prevent fixing of instruments, the forbidden act. A shavut can be removed if that malacha it guards against is no longer an issue. And we're making the case that according to Tosafot, maybe fixing isn't an issue. I'm not going to fix my broken guitar if I drop it on Shabbos. It's just going to not get played anymore. And lastly, a shvut can be removed for the sake of a mitzvah or for the public good. And here we're making the case that perhaps, or at least Spitz and Dorff make the case, that the public good of increased participation and beautifying our services might be a reason that even if that shvut still applies, we want to drop it. But we've made the case and we've said, we've seen in our sources that we already do clap and dance on Shabbat, and we were doing that 500 years ago. Okay. The rabbis allowed for slapping, clapping, and dancing once fixing was no longer an issue. We covered the issue of fixing versus tuning. Fixing and tuning are not the same thing. Tuning a guitar is not necessarily fixing. Fixing a string is probably fixing. And tuning an organ is probably closer to fixing than tuning a guitar. Lastly, the carrying issue, which curiously doesn't come up all that often in the sources, but is a concern, right? When we think about shofar on Shabbat. And perhaps the reason we're stringent about that is there's 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. So if one happens to be Shabbat shofar, a day you can't blow the shofar, you can on the other day. And lastly, this piece of mourning the temple and ceasing from singing and playing music generally, which was lessened again over the centuries as well. And possibly didn't always apply to prayer, but applied to simcha music, playing music outside of prayer. Okay, so that's the last, and this is our last concluding thoughts. Instrumental music has always been instrumental, in Jewish prayer and worship and services from the time of the temple onward. Instrumental music is not a performance, but should be used to enhance the prayer service, invite people in, and serve the prayer itself, much like vocal music already does in our tefillah, right? That the complaints that you have against a choir leading to less, not you, but one might have about a choir leading to less participation. Musical instrumentation can also lead to less participation, but both of those things can lead to more participation, and that is the ultimate goal, right? It's like she had not yet decided whether to use her powers for good or evil. It can go either way, and that's the careful balancing act that is summarized here by what Rabbi Eli Spitz says. If, as Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel has taught, Shabbat is a palace in time, then there is a need for an architecture of restraint in which to craft holy space. Such an architectural plan is subject to review and reconfiguration, which while keeping in mind the ultimate goals of setting aside holy time and permitting the removal of unnecessary barriers. We honor differences in our movement while retaining a commitment to Shabbat as a time set apart from the remainder of the week for spiritual uplift. In other words, all of this is to say that as we decide how and when and if to include musical instruments and anything we include, a choir, youth participation, volunteer participation, whatever we use to construct our prayer service, we do so with thoughtfully, with intentionality towards crafting this holy space and holy time. And so again, we want to make sure that as we look at the sources that allow us to bring instrumentation into our worship service, what are the goals that we as a community have for our services, and how do we best reach those? So that is the conclusion of the formal, unless Rabbi Dan, you have anything to add to what I just said?
No. Just I think you said it well. Like the goal, our goal here was to bring the halachic sources, not to like in what we just present a should you or shouldn't you, just as sort of like this question that is especially prompted by the pandemic and the Zooming and things like this, which is like our last session on Zooming and things like that, which is that, wait a minute, is this okay? Like, what are the sources on this? That this, of course, is a much deeper sort of array of sources on, and just to bring it, not in the should we or shouldn't we up to this point, but like, is this something that is that is in any way permissible or not, as it were? So that's all I wanted to accomplish here, and we can move to chat. I'm not good at multitasking that way, so I haven't been reading the chat. So
right. That was Gabe's job. Gabe is our moderator, so I will turn it, I guess, to Gabe to sort of put together the categories of questions and comments that have come up. Again, I did notice as I was scrolling a lot of the sort of what feels right, this feels too reform. By the way, I just want to make a distinction. It's reform, not reformed. Reform is the movement's name. Reformed sounds like there was something wrong with them and they were fixed, but that's not it is reform, meaning we reform Judaism. And as we say conservative, as we conserve Judaism. So just as a point of information, it's reform, not reformed. And whether something feels reform or not, well, there are good things to the left and the right of us that we can borrow from or choose to distinguish ourselves from. Again, that's a conversation for a second conversation that we will have. So Gabe, what are the questions we have?
Yeah, so I want to focus on the halakha questions. So one question that you guys touched on at times, but came up so often I want to bring up is there a halakhic distinction between different types of instruments? A shofar, is that even an instrument? Simple instruments like cymbals and blocks, percussion instruments, string instruments. That's definitely been the common theme.
That's a fascinating one because oddly enough, like I've historically thought of the percussion instruments as being were more permitted than more complex, for lack of a better word, instruments. Though what's fascinating is the Mishnah takes the exact opposite, right? It doesn't want you clapping or slapping your knees. And it seems that is at least like one of the possibilities is that Shabbat is supposed to be peaceful, Shabbat Shalom, and that just the sort of the sharp noises of that sort of thing are maybe what they're trying to get away from. In addition,
there's a sense of this excessive noise comes up in a couple of the sources. That's why when there is the Mishnah Shulchan Aruch's piece on rattling a rattle for a baby, that there's a sense of like excessive noise. And Davka, I also, as Rabbi Dan did, had a presumption that like, oh, because you're allowed to, because I see clapping everywhere, banging on tables are okay, so drums are okay too, because it's the musical instruments as opposed to the percussive ones that are the issue. But as Rabbi Dan just said, it does seem to be the other way around.
Yeah, which is fascinating. So this is like when we say that like we, like kind of the goal is to continue learning things. So yeah, so like that. So yes and no, meaning that commonly that's sort of the case. And when that's the case, and there are places like that. The last time I was in Los Angeles, which is many years ago now, over Shabbat, was I went to Ikar, which is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful minyan, and they and there are dozens of rabbis in the room, limit themselves to percussive instruments, and lots of them. And when you do that, I mean, sometimes sometimes it's a deliberate for a certain feel, and that's sort of the aesthetics of it, which is again like the organ. Some people, again, they'll say like, well, that doesn't feel Jewish; it feels like church, or the guitar. Some people would say in the chat like, so, oh, that doesn't feel conservative. It feels, or whatever it might be, that the percussion feels like different than that. Or sometimes people just like that. That's I went to one place, the Hebrew Education Alliance in Denver, which is another great place, where they had a service off the main sanctuary that involved percussion, and it was less on halachic grounds and more for that this will drive singing without the risk of drowning it out or calling too much attention to itself. But I'm not convinced, after reading all of the sources, that the stringed instruments, or even a piano, as it were, is more objectionable halachically than percussion. That's not entirely clear. You might make that decision on aesthetic grounds, but it's not clear, because the one thing the Mishnah does prohibit is clapping.
Yeah, and I'll just add to it, I think that there's a lot of things that are sort of what I would call folkways. Like we hear, oh, we don't do this because. And I think that I would say that the distinction developed because, well, if you're allowed to bang on the table, a drum is just like the table, right? I feel like there's a little bit of that happening, that it's not a sense of, well, drum's not really a musical instrument. It's just a thing you bang on, which ask any drummer and they'll kill you for that, right? So yeah, I think that's really where that develops. Gabe, what's another question?
So maybe a good follow-up on that is there was a question early on about clapping. You said, oh, but that people clap. Does everybody clap? Is that across all movements? What do you mean by everybody clapping? Was the question.
Yeah, I think if you go to, I mean, I can't speak for the Satmars, but I know that I don't think they do much singing at all. But most places, banging on tables is part of the oneg of singing Shabbat songs.
Which in a sense is like likely just as loud and louder than clapping. And I feel like it's the case. Like I feel like I've been in Orthodox settings with clapping, and clapping is specifically the one that keeps coming up over the course of the centuries, out of saying that people are going to do it anyway. Don't tell them they're doing something wrong because the punishments on high are less for violations that you do accidentally than on purpose. And given that they're going to do it no matter what, better they do it accidentally and not purposely violating the law. So clapping seems to be across the board and dates denominations that it's been across the board.
Yeah. And early on, like before there were denominations, right? Like this seems to have been something that people were already doing, and the leniencies had been invoked in the 1400s. So it's like, yeah.
There's also someone brought up the concept of muksa. They had heard that musical instruments were muksa, so you're not supposed to even touch them or move them. I thought it'd be helpful to explain what muksa is.
Yeah, so the muksa piece, I'll start, and then Dan, maybe you can do a little of it. I saw that comment. The something becomes muksa when the act that it is for, muksa means set aside. Or there's this whole idea of what muksa is. It doesn't just mean that it's a forbidden thing, but that it has no purpose. So for example, this is really esoteric, but if my pencil is muksa because it's for writing, but if I designated before Shabbat that I'm going to use this pencil as a back scratcher, it's no longer muksa. I'm allowed to use it because I designated it as my back scratcher. So the idea is that a musical instrument is considered muksa if you've decided that the thing you use it for is forbidden on Shabbat. So it's the backwards of the argument. If we're saying that you're allowed to do it on Shabbat, then the object is permitted to be held, rather than the other way around. But it's not a forbidden object. It's not muksa, and therefore you can't use it. It becomes muksa when you're not allowed to use it. Did I do that right?
Yeah. So yeah, muksa, something that you don't touch on Shabbat because it is likely to lead to a violation. Now, you're not supposed to put fences on fences. I mean, even in the Halakha, you're not supposed to put a fence on a fence, because in the end, then suddenly there's no end to anything, right? So it's just so you're supposed to put like one level. This we can all put in the chat how we know that this has been violated in 1,000 different areas of Jewish life, but that's the way it's supposed to roll. So if using it, if I have a pen in my hand, odds are I'm gonna mindlessly write with it, and then I violated Shabbat. So answer, don't touch the pen. So that's what muksa is. So if the concern is that if I touch an instrument, I'm going to start to play it, which is going to lead to a repair, then don't even touch it. Like this. So that's where if the instrument is muksa, that's because you're in the one who says that is in the camp of the rule, the repairing instruments is too great a risk, and you shouldn't be doing it. And if you say that it's not muksa, then you're probably in the well, I don't even know how to repair it, so I can't. So the risk of my repairing of my triggering a repair and then doing it is so remote that it's not even in the realm of possibility.
Gabe.
There was one more thing. There's some recent stuff, but something from earlier on that I didn't want to get lost. Was there was a question about creation and active creativity, and so would musical improvisation, would that be problematic?
Physical creativity, creativity that you can see in the world. So I can come up with a new idea on Shabbat and share it in Devar Torah, and you see that happen every week. Right, so that sort of creativity is fine, but it's the creating something, changing something in the world, and that's where the breaking a stick off, you've changed something in the world, or planting a seed in the ground doesn't take a lot of work, but you're not supposed to do it because it's creating something in the world.
Yeah, I've heard it described as like first of all, the 39 prohibited acts are things that were used to create the temple in particular, or the Mishkan, actually, the tabernacle. So those are the because of that, those 39. Yes, I have it too. I have it in Hebrew. The Avos Malacha of Sabbath. It's that's a great book, by the way. Love that book. And it's a kid's book. It's an illustrated book on the things you're not allowed to do. And it's very interesting because it doesn't actually say you're not allowed to do those things on Shabbat in the Torah either, by the way. It simply lists these acts and says you're not allowed to do melacha, this thing called melacha. And the rabbis then say, well, what's melacha? It must be those 39 things that were just enumerated for building the tabernacle. So I've always heard a poetic understanding of when people are like, ha, 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 you're not supposed to work on Shabbat, but you're a rabbi, you work on Shabbat, that work is creative acts in the sense of we cease creation in deference to the great creator, that for 6 days of the week, we do things that make stuff. And on the seventh day, we cease from that kind of creative endeavor to say there is someone greater than us who creates what we create, who has created a world in which we create. So I kind of love that explanation. So that allows me to, understand why, as one of my teachers once said, I could lift a 50-pound weight all day long. It's work. I am working so hard with this big old weight in my hand, but that's not violating any of the melacha. If I take my stick and I dig a hole in the ground or just drag a hole in the ground, that's making a furrow. That's melacha. But this feels like work and this doesn't. It's not about what feels like work. And it's not about, as the question posed, it's not about creativity in the sense of musical improvisation or Devar Torah improvisation or making up rhymes with your friends because you can't write stuff down. Whatever that is, that's allowed. It's the great creator that we're being deferring to. Gabe, any others?
And there's some recent ones. Again, so there's a lot about people's feelings and this feels right, this doesn't feel right. But on Halakha, there was a recent one about just the Halakhic process. How does the decision get made policy-wise at the synagogue? Is it communal? Is it discretionary for the rabbis?
Oh, before we hit that one, because that's a good one for Rabbi Dan to answer, I do see Andrea's question about services and the difference between the services and Kiddush and Oneg. There's a whole other body of teshuvot, of responsa by our movement about, can you have a band at a bar mitzvah, like a kiddush for the bar mitzvah? And that they do make a distinction between the two. There is a difference. There is it's a little outside of the scope of what we're doing here, but I'm happy to talk about that separately. There is a distinction made, and a lot of ink, typewriter ink, actually. It's all typewriter on a PDF spilled on this. So.
Yes. I don't take.
But Stan, if you wanted to talk about how decisions are made in our congregation,
here we would in this setting, that sort of thing rolls through the Jewish Life Committee, which is to say, the rabbi's job is, in normal times, to sort of like set the parameters of halakha, meaning is this permitted or is this prohibited? But a lot of the sort of like aesthetic decisions or things that are non-halachic are done like without. So with the Jewish Life Committee, and for something that's like more significant like this, that's sort of like it. This is part of a synagogue's brand, right? So all the more so in consultation with. In the last, I mean, now 10 months of pandemic time, we have sort of like arrogated to ourselves like the emergency powers that like that governors are commonly using, which is to say, in when faced with unanticipated temporary situations, let's just make quick decisions, and because that's what the time calls for. So just like, you know, shutdowns and things like this, lahavdil. So not just like that, it's different, but like similarly, like that was a decision, like we had to decide what to do right away and going to Zoom and so during the pandemic, this sort of fell into that category of how can we make Zoom services compelling, given that we're not singing together anymore. So that's what prompted the last few months. Going forward, as we hopefully at some point in time will move out of this state of being, then it becomes more of a communal decision of like sort of like, oh, what do we think is going to work for the if it's okay, what do we think is going to work for the synagogue? But it is like the reason why we sort of consulted these sources and like dusted off these dusty books was to like address the issue publicly in both for where we're at now and so that we can intelligently make decisions together going forward.
Two more questions regarding clapping. One was, what's the logic that he said clapping would lead to repairing an instrument? You know, clapping doesn't, you know, how did that even happen in the first place?
You'll have to ask the Mishnah. I don't know. I mean, the Mishnah says it. I'm going to bring up the source really quick. Yeah, I think, I mean, just as a recap of what it says, hang on, let me go back. I mean, I think where it comes from, we didn't give you the whole, well, here it is. There's this whole sort of logic that basically says I mean, I can only imagine, you can fill in the blanks. Like you're clapping, you're having a great time. Oh, let me go grab my guitar. Oh no, my guitar is broken. Let me fix it quickly. I think in the throes of the clapping and dancing, you might become so overjoyed that you forget the Sabbath. I don't know, but there's a couple of these, right? There's the climb a tree because you might pull off a branch or inadvertently step on a branch. You can't ride an animal. Riding an animal is fine because it says elsewhere. This source is truncated, but there's a place where he says if you ride the animal and the animal's not going fast enough and you look up above, you're going to again pull a branch off to use a little goading device. What are those things called? Like a whip to keep your animal. So it's never really says what the logic is there, but again, it's the important part is whatever the logic was, is that one is to prevent the other, and once we no longer have to worry about the other, we don't have to present the to be as strict about the former.
Yeah, it seems to presume with some raucous atmosphere affected by the clapping. Right, we should begin to wrap up. Though I do want to say that I've saved the chat so that all of the like I think this and I think that, or I feel this or I feel that, like those sorts of things, we'll be able to like read and process so that your words won't be lost, even though again I can't concentrate on both at once. But we should begin to wrap up. What you said there was one more from that, Gabe?
There was a question of the prohibition from clapping. Is that related to we don't applaud someone for that was a marvelous haftarah?
I always took that to be actually more because it's not a performance. It's a tefillah moment, and we don't clap and applaud for moments of worship. Yeah,
I never thought of it one way or the other. I always thought of it as sort of like a decorum thing,
yeah,
rather than a.
Instead, we throw candy. I mean, that's decorum out the window. But yeah,
it's a funny thing, right? Rather than that, though. Fascinating, but again, like it's sort of weird because again, you're then go to you have a Shabbos dinner and like banging on the table is sort of like a signature in sort of across the board.
I mean, I think
Yeah,
that's I think it's a cross-cultural thing. I don't think, and I mean, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I feel like in other houses of worship, one doesn't clap at the end of a good sermon, right? Like, I mean, well, Baptist and sort of that kind of milieu, but like in a more traditional, yeah, you'll do something like this, right, Arlene? Is that, I've seen this, but I feel like it's a little, I feel like that's just a house of worship kind of decorum
Well,
rather.
and there's some that'll raise their hands,
Yeah.
and it's just when I was participating at my sister's house of worship, she warned me ahead of time that there were people that were going to raise their hands, and
Yeah.
that was their way of saying that what I was doing was really getting to them, that their spirit was really getting involved, that I was really bringing a feeling of rejoicing and spiritual moving, and that it was really bringing something to the worship service as I was participating, leading them in worship. And I'm not used to the hand going up in the middle of my playing. And so there are different responses. And I'll say that one of the participants at a place I was came up to start, and she said, if anybody's going to clap, I'm going to leave.
So essentially, but again, it does sort of reinforce my gut, which is that it's just that's less, I mean, because certainly in a Christian house of worship, no one is concerned about the Shabbat violation in the same way. I think that the clapping is really an aesthetic thing that we just don't do in services.
I want to thank you. I want to begin to wrap up. Gabe, thank you for moderating. Again, I've saved the pieces for us. I want to thank everyone for participating. Rabbi, did you have any additional? Nope. And then where I'd like to end is I grew up in a Reform synagogue. There was a gigantic organ in the corner in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and they've removed the organ. The building was built in the 20s when organs were the thing. It was a stylistic thing. And they removed it because now guitars are the thing stylistically, and they didn't need, they wanted the space rather than the gigantic organ.
Accordions are next. No, just kidding.
Yeah, we'll see where music goes. So some of it's Jewishly, and in terms of like what people like and don't like, so at some level is aesthetic, and those discussions will be what will come in the future. But I also wanted to throw that in because as part of where my mind is, like just before we started, when we were beginning, I texted my parents because the nation's eyes are looking elsewhere. There was a decision not to charge the officer in the Kenosha shooting from this past summer, and at that very synagogue, the windows are boarded up for fear of rioting or unrest taking place in the wake of the presumed not charging. Though it might be too cold for that, but all of this is meant to find ways to connect us to God and to connect us to creating a more godly and more peaceful world. And part of me tonight is also thinking of that synagogue with an organ. That had an organ that I grew up in is boarded up tonight because we're still working on all of that, and that all of this is all ways to try and help build the kind of souls that we can do the kind of work that we still need to do. With that, I want to again thank you for coming, and it's a discussion that we'll be able to continue to have. Next month we'll pick up with another halachic topic. I believe we're going in a totally different direction regarding sexual orientation. That's where we're at.
Yeah, sexual orientation.